Chapter 45. The St. Andrews Social Club. Ed and Jim arrived at St. Andrews in the fall, ready to be big men on campus. It was a lovely place, the drives lined with pink dogwood trees. There was a large lake in the center, with residential halls on one side and academic buildings on the other. Every day, students would cross a causeway to class, enjoying the view of old cypress trees lifting their knobby knees around the edges of the lake. The dining hall was on the edge of the water, and students marked the birthdays of their friends by dragging them away from the table and tossing them into the lake. Ed was in for a bit of a shock. He was coming from a very secular college where the band Earth, Wind, and Fire was about as spiritual as things got. He'd seen students drinking too much and girls slipping into boys' rooms after hours, but that was to be expected. He assumed things would be different at a Presbyterian college. They weren't. If anything, they were worse. Preachers' kids who'd chafed at being good all their lives would buy a keg of beer as soon as they got to college and drink it as fast as possible. Classes were of minor importance. It was interesting to note that many of those freshmen didn't come back after Christmas. The ones who did paid more attention to their studies. Ed and Jim began to make friends. They'd hang out with their buddies, laughing and telling jokes or going to the gym for a swim or bowling. They'd made friends with the good girls that lived on one hall in the women's dorm, often stopping by to visit and hang out. One day, Ed discovered 2 hairs growing on his chest. He felt so manly and proud he had to show someone, and so he walked to the girls' dorm. He bumped into his friend Carol and said, "Hey, Carol, look at this!" He pulled down the neck of his shirt. "What?" asked Carol. I don't see anything." "There, right there," Ed insisted. "I've got 2 chest hairs." "Wow," said Carol sarcastically. She lowered her collar. "I've got 3." Ed, Jim, and their friends wanted to come up with a name for their group. They settled on the SASC. This was code for the St. Andrews Stud Club, because they were pretty sure they were the best-looking guys on campus. To tone it down a bit for general consumption, they publicly called themselves the St. Andrews Social Club, which may have been a lot more accurate. Boogie nights hit the campus as the disco era dawned. Ed and Jim bought Saturday Night Fever shirts and platform shoes. They learned how to do the hustle, the funky chicken, and the bump. One of their favorite dances was the washing machine. It was a dance they made up. They'd pretend to put a quarter in the washer, add a little detergent and bleach, and begin to agitate. With shoulders gyrating, they'd move around the floor until it was time for the spin cycle. Then it was every man for himself. Ed was feeling more comfortable around girls and not quite so shy. They liked to dance with him, so he learned more dance steps. Little did he know that one day he'd be showing middle school kids the electric slide at his first teaching job. Ed and Jim also ran track and cross country. Jim, though he was younger, was faster, but both he and Ed made the varsity teams, competing in 5-mile cross-country races and the half-mile and mile races in track. They'd take off for long training runs through the sandhills of eastern North Carolina, then come back to the campus where Coach Blackie Blackwell would have them run a few pyramids until they felt like throwing up. It did make them faster, though. At his last race of the season, Ed was entered in the mile run. He lined up with Jim and several runners from other colleges. The gun went off, and away they went. Ed was feeling good that day. Very good. He led the pack around the first turn and headed down the straightaway. After the first lap, he was still in the lead. After the second lap, no one had passed him. He was striding faster than he'd ever run. Now, the third lap in a mile race is the killer. The lungs start to burn, the legs start to go. As Ed headed into the bell lap, a runner from another school passed him, and then another. With his lungs on fire, he pushed himself as hard as he could go. He would never run another race at St. Andrews. When he finally crossed the line, he was in third place. But looking down at his watch, he broke into a huge grin. 4 minutes, 53 seconds. Not only was it his personal best, it tied the fastest mile his dad had ever run. He was very satisfied. After the race, Ed and Jim grabbed their gear and hopped into the back of a conversion van with several of their friends. They were headed across the state to spend the weekend with a friend, Christy, in her hometown of Spartanburg, South Carolina. They dropped their things off at her house and went out that evening to cruise around town. As they approached the main intersection downtown, Ed suggested they do a Chinese fire drill. When they came to the stoplight, everyone was to jump out of the van, run all the way around it, and jump back in before the light changed. Everyone on the sidewalk and waiting at the light would be left staring. It was just something silly college kids did for fun. Only Eddie decided to make it a bit more interesting. He was still in his skimpy track outfit, though he'd put some sweats on over top. This was at the height of the streaking craze, so he decided he'd pretend to go streaking. When the van stopped at the busiest intersection in the city, Ed and his friends all tumbled out the back of the van and started to dash in a circle around it. They were yelling and screaming. Everyone stopped what they were doing to watch. As he pulled around the back fender, Ed ripped off his sweatshirt. Going past the driver's window, he pulled off his running shoes. All his friends were in front of him, so they didn't understand why people were staring and mothers were covering their children's eyes. As Ed passed the passenger window, he slipped out of his racing shirt, leaving only his sweatpants. He knew full well that he had on his racing shorts underneath, but the people didn't know that. As he came around the last corner, his friends were tumbling into the open back doors. He stuck his thumbs into the waistband of the sweatpants and jerked them to the ground. Then, laughing, he leaped into the back and he closed the door. The van pulled away. But Ed could still hear people laughing. When he looked around, his friends were pointing at him and guffawing so hard they could barely breathe. Looking down, Ed realized he'd made a mistake. Instead of only sticking his thumbs into the waistband of his sweatpants, he'd stuck them all the way into the band of his racing shorts. He was sprawled on the floor of the van in the all together. His face turned red as he desperately reached for his sweats. The shame was unbearable.